As promised, tonight we're going to talk about some of the issues and some of the principles about how we as a congregation use the money that we collect. It's a big topic and it can go on for a long time. There's lots of ways you could, lots of subjects you could dive into and questions you could explore. It will not be exhaustive. I would suggest that I don't know that there's any way to quantify it, but I would guess that how the churches use money has spawned as many debates as any subject in church history. There's just lots of judgment calls to be made and lots of scriptures to look at and lots of principles to try to apply correctly. And not everybody agrees on all these things. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. I want to start with some really crystal clear commands and examples that we have that I think there's unanimous agreement on. And then we'll talk about some other things that are not quite so clear as we kind of move along. And how do we answer some of those questions, or what are some ways that we can think about them? So that's going to be the subject of tonight's lesson. And grab a Bible and follow along. We're going to begin by looking at two main areas that are specifically addressed in the Bible. We're going to start with several passages in Acts. And these that are specifically addressed have to do with benevolence or needy Christians. Lots of examples of that among your own group, and then benevolence toward Christians who are far away. Clear commands and examples about that. And then support of preachers and elders in your own group and far away. That'll be the first thing. And this is the part that I think there would be unanimous understanding because it's just so cut and dried and clear. And we have a host of scriptures to look at that I think this is the part that's really easy about all of this question. So beginning in Acts chapter 2, we have this notion of fellowship, and fellowship is sharing together. It's a partnership, having things in common. Communion is part of the same word as fellowship. It's to share together. And we share together in lots of ways as part of God's people. We become part of a family of God that is a sharing family. And we see in Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 41, those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, breaking of bread and prayers. All came upon every soul. Many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Notice that this is a description of a community of believers. It says in verse 44, all who believed were together and had all things in common. As people were converted, they joined this fellowship of believers. And in this fellowship of believers is a basically big spiritual family. And in the family took care of each other. We see this described in more detail in chapter 4 of Acts. Chapter 4, verse 32, beginning. It says, the full number of those who believed, so we're talking again about the church, were of one heart and soul. And no one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had all things in common. With great power, the apostles were giving testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. Great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them. For as many as were owners of lands and houses sold them, brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. I believe Ben brought this verse up this morning in our Bible class as we discussed helping with someone in Zimbabwe. So this is the group there. At this time, there was basically one church on the whole face of the earth. Everybody was there before they spread out. And so, but as people were converted, they joined this body of believers and they shared. So if someone was in need and someone else had something they could share with them, even if it meant selling some property, they would do that. And they hand that to the apostles. The apostles were kind of in charge of making sure that it got distributed to where it needed to go. But they were sharing and they had this common care for one another. And that is certainly something that, hopefully we will never forget. And as those opportunities arise in our family for where someone is in need or someone is facing hardship, It should just come as second nature to us, just like it would if your own flesh and blood family was in need. You wouldn't hopefully think twice about helping out. And it should be just as natural to us as spiritual family if we go through some difficulty that we would help out and we would, relieve that need as we are able to do so. I think that's what the Lord clearly has in mind for his people. Next, we think about, and I'll put these verses on the screen. Well, we got one more to go to in Acts chapter 11. In addition to this idea of benevolence within your congregation, which is what we were looking at there, there is also the idea of benevolence to needy Christians, the extended family, let's say. So in Acts chapter 11, verse 27, beginning, it says, "Now in those days, prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them named Agabus stood up and foretold by the Spirit there would be a great famine over all the world that took place in the days of Claudius. So the disciples determined, everyone according to his ability, to send relief to the brothers living in Judea. And they did so, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul." And notice again here in this Acts chapter 11 that this famine affected the whole world. And I'm sure that means they're part of the world where they were, but it was a famine that was widespread people. But the disciples in verse 29 decided to send relief to the brothers in Judea, and they did it by sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul for distribution. You might remember that in our discussion, Kurt asked if one of these churches down there in Zimbabwe have elders, and I assume that the reason he's asking is because of patterns like this, where aid to needy Christians or those who were facing hardship, brethren in one area sent that relief to the elders to be distributed, and that's kind of a natural thing. It started out being the apostles, and it seems that role that the apostles played in distributing the funds then passed on to elders. And so in a typical scenario, if you have an area where there's been some hardship, whether it be like famine or whatever else, I would assume some massive flooding or tornadoes or a hurricane or wildfires or whatever, and you have the family of God there, that you could find a church and find out they've been affected. You, in one area, could take up and send relief according to their ability and send it to the elders there, and they would distribute that to those who were affected. Like in Kentucky, let's say, if there's brethren there and there's churches that they've been affected by these floods and they need help, if we had the means to be of assistance, we could certainly do that. And one of us or two of us could take a bunch of stuff and then head up there, whether it's material goods like bottles of water or whatever, or whether it's just cash to help them with whatever their needs would be. And then you would hope that out. And this is, again, within the family of God. That's the pattern that we're seeing here, that this is kind of like now we have this extended family, but we're all helping take care of each other. Now, I've got some other verses outside of Acts that go along with that. Romans 15. At present, however, he says, I'm going to Jerusalem to bring aid to the saints. I'm going to highlight that phrase because we're going to talk about later what about people who are not Christians. But I want you to notice how specific all of these instructions are, that this benevolent aid was intended to be for those who are part of the family, part of this fellowship. So in Romans 15, he says he's going to Jerusalem. He's bringing aid to the saints. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. So there's lots of poor people, I'm sure. But this particular collection and this aid that they were doing, this ministry, was aimed at the Christians who were poor in Jerusalem. And so the Christians in Macedonia and Achaia were glad to help. This is the cut and dried example of exactly what we're doing in Zimbabwe, where you have people who were in their day and age around the world. Now, maybe not as many miles away as we are, but when you go from Achaia and Macedonia, basically Greece, to Jerusalem, would have been on the other side of their world, on the other side of a long ways away. People they would probably mostly never meet or see in person. But you had people like Paul and others who traveled. And so as Paul would come around, he let them know about this opportunity. And they said, yeah, we want to help. So they gathered up stuff and they said, here, take this to the people. unknown people that they would never see. They didn't even have the benefit like we do of pictures and videos and stuff like that. They would just say, take this to whoever it is. And then as Paul would go around, he would take that and he's writing to them. He said, I'm coming to you, but first I got a thing I got to do. I'm taking this aid package to the Christians in need in Jerusalem. And there's more instructions along those lines. This is our passage where we come with the authority for doing a collection to begin with, 1 Corinthians 16. Now, concerning the collection, again, notice for the saints. As I directed the church of Galatia, so you also are to do. This is an instruction he taught a lot of Christians. On the first day of every week, each one of you is to put something aside, store it up as he may prosper, so there'll be no collecting when I come. This is where we get our authority and our idea for having a collection in general. And it is because of this example that Paul gave them, where he was part of that effort to bring aid to the family of believers in Judea. He gave them instructions, as we've already seen in that previous passage. And he said, when I come by, I'll pick up what you got and I'll take it with me. And so he said, and basically between now and then, every Sunday, you guys be piling it up. So when I get there, we don't have to scramble around to, finding everybody's stuff. It'll all be together is the implication. And then when I get there, I'll be able to take it. Now notice, imagine if you were them and you were there, you'd be piling up an amount, however long it took before Paul came. And I assume when he left, it would be back to zero, wouldn't you think? Like your balance would go from whatever it was, because you were collecting this specifically for this aid relief. And then left town, all of the stuff you had gathered up would go with him probably. And it would be taken to go to some place across the world to help out needy Christians. And so, if you would compare that to today, if somebody came and they left with, everything that we've collected, and they took it to go help, imagine the good they could do. And that would be pretty much fitting with this pattern of instructions that Paul gives to the Corinthians. Same thing is in his second letter. He's still preparing to come collect it. He says they gave according to their means. He's encouraging them to be like the brethren in Macedonia who, although they were poor, had been very generous. And beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for favor and taking part of the relief of the saints. Again, I'm highlighting that detail because that's part of this pattern of instructions that we find in the same letter a chapter later. He continues there in chapter 9, but again, it mentions that this was about the ministry for the saints. Another example, kind of unrelated to that effort, has to do with taking care of widows in your midst. And in 1 Timothy 5, this probably belonged more to the previous point of among us instead of elsewhere. But he says there in 1 Timothy 5, it's quite a bit more to it than just this, but when it came to taking care of the widows, he said, if a believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let not the church be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. And if you look at the requirements for truly widows, there's like a little paragraph there of requirements. They had washed the saints' feet, had cared for people, and they were all alone. They were a certain age. There's some restrictions on that. But basically, the church had a responsibility to care for widows who were truly widows, meaning they had no one to help them, and they had been faithful in their service to others. And it's implied pretty clearly they were Christians as well. And then, but if you had widows in your own family, you had the primary obligation to those widows, and then let the church take care of the ones who don't have someone to take care of. You can understand the logic of that. Again, it's just that the family is taking care of itself. And what a wonderful safety net. What a wonderful blessing that you as a Christian can know that if your spouse or mom or anybody in your family, ends up being left alone, they're not going to be destitute because they have the family of God to care for them. And that's, again, part of our obligation. First of all, to your own flesh and blood relatives, but then the church to its own as well as a spiritual family. God wants us to take care of each other. So that's part of this, what we lump together and call benevolence. And in all of these verses that we've seen, it is something that is a family obligation, let's say, within the family of God. Hopefully that much is clear. I doubt that you would have any disagreement with him. Well, if you want to disagree, that's fine. You'll just be wrong. Because That much is crystal clear in the scriptures, and there's no kind of room. In my mind, I don't see how anybody could argue with that. You'd be arguing with the clear, black and white text of the New Testament if you didn't think we should use our funds for this kind of work. That's definitely authorized, and we need to do that kind of stuff. Now, another thing that we have authority for is essentially the support of those who labor among the church. Let the one who's taught share in all good things with the one who teaches. There's this kind of back and forth reciprocity. Someone who is teaching, and then the people who are being taught are sharing in their goods with the one who's teaching. That's just a basic principle. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says that it was the Lord's command, those who proclaim the gospel get their living by the gospel. Interestingly, in this same context, he said, but I didn't take advantage of that right because he didn't want to burden the Corinthians. So he would do things like get support from outside churches. And sometimes he would do things like use his trade that he had, which was tent making, and he would sometimes provide for himself. So at various times in his ministry, he was working with his hands to provide for himself in addition. And there were times when he was getting outside churches. So there's not like a one-size-fits-all solution to that. But certainly it is authorized for churches to support in financial, material ways those who labor in the gospel, including elders. We don't talk about this a lot, but there's a clear passage in 1 Timothy 5 that the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. That honor is not real clear until you read the rest of the context, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox that treads the grain, and the labor deserves its wages. So if you have an elder who is preaching and teaching, this is authority there for supporting him as well for that work. Again, I think there's no question about this part. I don't think anybody would argue with any of that. Not only those who are kind of in your immediate church family, but even elsewhere, as I've said, Paul refers to how, for example, the churches in Philippi, that church, he said, as you Philippians yourselves know, in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership. That's that same word, fellowship, with me in giving and receiving, except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. So this is our clear authority for a preacher that we know who is somewhere, and you can send and have a partnership in his work by having fellowship with him in giving and receiving, even though he is working in another field. In this case, Paul says he left them and he went on, and he was in Thessalonica. But the Christians in Philippi, more than once, were sending him help so that he could do his work of ministry in a foreign place to them. And so we do that too. We do that with Wayne. We do that with Richie. We do that with the brothers in Zimbabwe. And this is the biblical pattern and example of that kind of thing where one church can fund, and help support those who labor in the word somewhere else. These are the specifically addressed things. Everybody hopefully can see that very clearly. Now let's talk about some things that are not quite so clearly spelled out, okay? And this is when you start getting into area where you have to make a bunch of judgments and there's room for different ideas. Oh, I forgot, I had one more. Another example of Paul talking about how he robbed other churches. I think you mean obviously using that figuratively to their support from them in order to serve you. And so when Paul was working among the Corinthians, he was being supported by other churches to do his work there. So again, just authority for that kind of arrangement. Okay. Now, let's use the word implied. Now, some of this, I'll tell you, I have studied my entire life, like most of you probably, and it's still, whenever I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. It's not cut and dry. So here's a implication. The implication is that if the Lord commands us to do something, like assemble, which we are commanded to do, we assume that we are authorized to spend our resources to obey that command. So in this case, to make it real simple, the Lord tells everybody, assemble. He wants his people to come together once a week at least and worship together as a family and take the Lord's Supper. And so we say, well, how should we do that? Well, there's a lot of ways, right? You could do that in somebody's house. And you find examples in the New Testament of churches meeting in people's homes. That's actually the most clear-cut example that we have. But we know some of these churches are fairly sizable. You could tell, like the church at Corinth, if you just read the letter to them, the problems they had, some said, I follow Apollos, some. I mean, it's a pretty sizable group. It wasn't just a couple of families. And you have to wonder, like, where did these people assemble? We don't really know. Where did the church, where they all come together? We know in Acts, sometimes they met at the temple for a little while. And there's another passage that said they met in the school or the hall of Tyrannus for a little bit. So there's some examples of them meeting in various places. I'm sure just like they had to find some place they could all meet. Well, in very practical terms, for us here in Fayetteville, when this particular congregation started meeting, they met in the old armory, not almost across the street, I think, from where my house is. And then, we're looking for a place, and this land was available, and they bought it. And I don't know all the history of that, but built a place here to meet. Now, where's the authority for that building? Well, it's sort of implied, we say. We assume we have the authority. That because we know the Lord wants us to assemble, so we assume that we're authorized to find a way to do that, whether that be renting a storefront, meeting in somebody's house, meeting on a field under a tree, building a building. And if you can tell I'm kind of squirming about that, it's because I would love it if we had like a clear whole chapter of the Bible on buildings, but we don't have that. So we have to make a whole lot of judgment calls about that. How big of a building? What all can you now think about what all comes with that? You've got property taxes, you've got utilities, you've got, water and electricity, and you got to have somewhere people go to the bathroom, and they may get thirsty, so you got a water fountain, and you've got carpet and pews and internet, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on. So if you look at like a list of bills that Kurt pays every month, on our behalf, a whole lot of those are because we have this building. And now the parking lot needs to be resealed and restriped, and we need to repair some things. We need reflectors. So we just have all kinds of expenses that come with the fact that we've chosen to have a building. And the authority for that is just implied in the command to assemble. And I think we're all comfortable with that as we're sitting here. You may, like me, have some questions about that. But we use our judgment. It's all another word that we used here in sermons a long time ago, expediency. And expediency is not really necessarily a New Testament word, but it just means how we use our judgment to try to do something the best way we can. We try to just figure out how we're going to solve this problem and use our own judgment. Right? Everybody understand? I think that's all we can say about it. There's not just a lot else there. Also, in the passage that Kurt read for us in Ephesians 4, he gave the apostles, prophets, evangelists, elders, and teachers for the building of the body of Christ. So it is part of our work as a church to teach and preach. And so we assume, again, it's an assumption, we assume that if the Lord wants us to teach and preach, that we could, for example, buy Bibles and have them in the pews. That we can buy class material for our classes, which we do. That we can have a projector because it's an aid in the teaching and preaching. That we can have this microphone and these speakers because it helps you be able to hear while we're teaching and preaching. So this is a work that we understand that the church is supposed to do, teaching and preaching. And we assume that if we've been told to do it, that we have the authority to spend some money to make it happen using our own judgment, that we can do that kind of thing. So on a pretty regular basis, we have expenses related to that. And also we have classrooms for classes, all as part of this idea that we're commanded and expected to teach and preach and have the body build itself up. Again, not a lot of specific, unlike the other where we had a host of scriptures, of like giving to saints in need. We have like tons of examples. We don't have tons of examples of them buying class books and all that kind of stuff, but we assume that authority is there because of the command to teach and preach. And it's in Ephesians chapter 4. It was just too long of a reading, and when Kurt asked me if I had a reading, I asked him to go ahead and read that one. So I don't have that one on the screen just because it was a lengthy reading. But there's other places as well where that was important when they came together to have Bible readings and that kind of thing. Psalm books, because we're told to sing, right? It's an expediency. They used to call it aids in addition, right? It's an aid because it helps us to be able to sing, we can all read the words together. Now we've replaced that with this thing, and again, that falls under the overall heading of we're trying to carry out that commandment. Okay? So that's some implied ways that we spend money. And then there's some other things and this is where the further you go down this trail, the more kind of differences you get where people have arrived at different conclusions. So we had a whole host of things about that within the family, we have needs that come up, and we take care of those needs. What about somebody in the community that's not a Christian? What about somebody in Florida where they've had a hurricane and they're not a Christian, but their house has been damaged by the hurricane or whatever, or a famine and all those kind of things. So as we saw, there was scripture after scripture after scripture about collecting and distributing to help the other saints in need. But sometimes the opportunity comes up to help just people who are not members of the family. And is that something the church can do? Well, there's two sides to this argument. The one side is that, look, all these scriptures say very clearly, that's why I had it highlighted for you, the saints, the saints, the saints, and that's what we're going to do. I'm going to show you two verses that sometimes come up on the other side of that argument that we can look at. So one of them is this Galatians 6. Galatians 6 says, let us not grow weary in doing good, for in due season we'll reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially those of the household of faith. So this passage says that there is a priority. The priority is on members of the family, especially, right? But that we're also supposed to be doing good to everybody. So this brings up the question of, does that mean then that this is an instruction for church and authority for us to use what we've collected to do good to everybody, but with just a special emphasis on the family? That's one way, and there are plenty of brethren, maybe some of you, that's how you've always understood this. The other side of this, when all this has been debated, is that this is really just talking about the Christian life, like how we're supposed to live that as individuals, but that when churches did things, all those other passages that I read to you that were addressed to churches, that when churches do benevolence, it's intended to be for saints. And that as Christians, as Jesus said, let your light shine that some people may see your good works and glorify God. That basically when you go through your day-to-day life, you should be doing good to everybody and helping people and showing love to your neighbor and all that, to just, the world in general. But that as a church, our mission is kind of restricted to just within the family. Those are the two sides of that argument. Now, historically, we have here taken the view that we're going to use what we collect according to that pattern that we looked at earlier, where it was sent to saints in need. We have that very clear pattern laid out. So when we look for opportunities to use our common treasury, we look for and we send it to brethren, churches, Christians, and whether that be here within our own midst or whether that be somewhere far away, we're following that pattern that we looked at in those first slides. There are people who would be totally comfortable with, in addition to that, using the money to do more broad, open-ended benevolence. But, that's just not the way that we've done things here. And so what that does, though, is it leaves it open for you or me to use your own funds how you see fit. If you want to support some effort or give to some homeless person or support a food pantry or a ministry for people of whatever type, homeless shelter, a battered women's shelter, St. Jude's Hospital, it just goes on and on and on and on. There's no end to the good things in the world that you can support yourself. But as we collect the money and we try to figure out how we're going to use this, we have those letters, those instructions to the churches that were pretty clearly said this was to be collected for, like that 1 Corinthians 16, the collection for the saints. So that's why we do it that way. One other passage to share that sometimes comes up. I just want to be fair to the scriptures and give you kind of the whole picture as best I understand it. In 2 Corinthians 9, in the same passage where verse 1 we read earlier, it's superfluous for me to write to you about the collection for the saints. Later in that same chapter, he says, the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, again, but it's also overflowing in many thanksgivings to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. Some people zero in on that, all others. They say, hey, look, you've got generosity for the saints, but who are these others? Is that non-Christians, or is that just talking about other saints besides these specific saints? It's hard to be 100% sure. So study that on your own. Look at the context, see if you can understand. I think you could read it either way. You could basically say these Christians are thankful that you've helped them as well as other Christians. That'd be all others still within the family. Or people have read that to mean you've been generous to them, the Christians, as well as others non-Christians. You could kind of read that either way, I think. So those are the two passages that come to my mind that Galatians 6 to all, especially the household of faith, and to this one, that are sometimes, at least what I've seen in these discussions, used to support the idea of a church collection going to people who are outside of the family, as we might say. All right? Now, another thing would be the social activities. So we talked about how under the category of implied authority, we have commands. We're told to assemble. We're told to take the Lord's Supper. So we have a place in here to prepare. We have a little mini fridge. We have, the juice in there. We have bread. Where do we get the authority for all the little metal trays and all? It's all because we're trying to carry out the Lord's command, and we assume that we have the authority to do that. But what about if we wanted to have a rec room? Or if we wanted to have even just a place where we could all get together for a potluck? Now, that's very common, and lots of churches have those. But one question we might ask is that something we were told to do as a church? Is there some command to get together for a meal in general? And we have examples of Christians. In fact, in Acts chapter 2, you remember that from house to house, they shared their meals. They got together in their homes. They were all like part of each other's lives. But we don't have a command to come together for a potluck, come together for social purposes, come together to play softball, or come together to play basketball, come together to play rook, or any of those kind of things. There's no, all of the commands that we have to do with worshiping, taking the Lord's Supper, singing, teaching. That's why we provide a facility that accommodates those things. But we try not to accommodate anything that's outside of the scope of what we've been commanded to do. So things like social activity. This is where you would get some different opinions among brethren at large, of course. You would have some who would feel totally comfortable with the church having a place for young people to get together and, shoot hoops. But we would ask, and I would ask, well, where's the authority for that? Because, is that something that we were told in the Bible that the church is supposed to do? Is that within another one? You could say, well, what about, could we use our collection to send people to college? Can you use your collection there's just all kinds of questions that come up. But as we try to sort through those, and I'm just telling you how we do it here, we look for where's our pattern, where's our command, where's our example, and this takes some judgment. And probably not everybody would decide those questions the same, if we're being honest. Probably not everybody in the room would decide those things the same. But that brings us to, so what do we do when we maybe don't agree? How do we handle that? What if you or I wouldn't see some of these questions the same? Well, one principle is, and this is from I always want to say, I always get them backwards. It's not Priscilla, but Ananias and Sapphira. When they gave in Acts 5 to that thing where they were collecting to share, remember they lied about how much they gave? Remember that story? And they were struck down? Well, before they were struck down, Peter said to them, hey, why'd you do this? While it remained your own, your property, while it was unsold, was it not your own? After it was sold, was it not at your disposal? Why have you contrived this deed in your heart? You've not lied to man, but to God. he's basically saying, look, it was at your disposal. It was your money. You could have done whatever you wanted with it. You didn't need to lie about it. But now that you've lied, but it's this principle that you have your money, and it's your disposal. So if there's something you want to do, you have the right to use your resources to support those things that you think are worthy causes, even if the congregation doesn't donate to that. If you feel like it's something you want to do or support, or if you want to have everybody together play rook at your house, those kind of things. If it doesn't have to be something the church does, you can do it. And we have that freedom individually to do those kind of things. And then the final thing is that, of course, in Romans 14, in a passage on where brethren have different scruples and views, it says, for one who's weak in the faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel. He didn't want them to be a bunch of arguing and quarreling over these things. And then let us pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. So in a realm of things where there's lots of judgment calls and lots of decisions to be made, and you guys voiced this morning, and I really appreciate it. We were discussing, for those of you who weren't here in Bible class, whether or not or how the church can help in the case of a specific need that came up in Zimbabwe. And several people said, well, this is why we have elders, and we trust you to make those decisions. So I do certainly appreciate the support for that. We just wanted to make sure you were informed and to get your thoughts and feedback. But it could very well be that there would be some decision made that would maybe you would have done more, you would have done it differently, and that's almost inevitable when you have so many decisions to make. And that's probably why this particular issue has led to so many arguments through the years. I'm thankful that we work together so peacefully and that you guys are so supportive here. And I hope you understand the approach that we take to how we use the Lord's money. I'm certainly always open to studying that again and discussing it again. And if I've said anything tonight that you feel like is not accurate or true to the word, I hope you would feel comfortable coming to me, and we'll sit down. Lee and I'll be glad to sit down and study these things together. Because I have a feeling that, we all kind of arrive here together from various paths, and we may not all have the same understanding of these things, but I'd be glad to study that with you. But I just wanted to go through that tonight, so you kind of have an idea as we collect this money. As we close, I want to say that one thing we try to do is better safe than sorry kind of approach. Like if we're not sure, I'll give you an example of one that we've been discussing. There's a church in Zimbabwe that needs a roof. All right, so now here's one that we've been kind of kicking around. It's one thing to talk about. Now we have authority, we think, to build our own roof, but what about building a roof on a church in Zimbabwe? We've been thinking about that for a while. And so sometimes an answer when we're not sure, and this was even brought up, Brother Jim brought up, several people did this. Well, what if we just had a separate collection? So you could say, in the case where we're not 100% sure, like we just can't be completely confident, then we might just say, hey, if you would like to send some money to help these people with the roof, see Lee, see Eric, see somebody, and it'll be do that outside of the work of the church. It would just be us as individual Christians. If you want to help that thing, so sometimes we answer that question that way as well. What we don't want to do though is be so afraid to use the Lord's money that we just sit on it, because I think that's part of the idea of the parable of the minas was they had something, and remember the one guy that just wrapped it up in a handkerchief and like hid it away because he was afraid. I mean, we want to use the resources, and I think we'll be called to account for how we have used the resources that have been placed at our disposal to be good stewards of those things. So we are constantly looking, Lee and I again this afternoon, and he's reaching out, and we're looking for men to support, work to do within the context of what we see authorized in the New Testament. We would like to be doing even more and more and more with what we've been entrusted based on your contributions. That's a lot of information. You've been very patient and good listeners. This hasn't been a lesson about how to become a Christian, of course, or those kind of things. But if there's someone here tonight who has anything